Good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Slatke. I'm Director of Public and Government Affairs for AAA Northeast, and we're delighted to have you here for the second edition of our Road to Reauthorization series as we look at all the different aspects of the Transportation Reauthorization Bill. Very exciting discussions going on at Capitol Hill. I'm sure very exhausting discussions for some of the folks involved, including our two panelists here today. But we're really happy to talk about safety this morning because we know it's such a crucial part of everything that we do at AAA and at the Governor's Highway Association, Safety Association. Obviously, that's the core of what we do. So we want to make sure that our elected officials, federal, I guess, officials and bureaucrats are really tuned into the safety issue. And we know, unfortunately, that last year was a very bad year for safety. And this year, you know, it could turn out to be another bad year as well. So we want to make sure that issue is on the top priority of everyone. So without further ado, I'm really excited to have here today a couple folks who are great experts, really great colleagues as well. So first off, I guess we'll go in alphabetical order. Russ Martin is Senior Director of Policy and Government Relations at the Governor's Highway Safety Association, but he is also part of the AAA family. He's a AAA alum. A few years ago, he headed up state relations, so it's all in the family here this morning for AAA. So Russ, good morning. Thanks for being here. And we also have Jake Nelson, who is at our AAA national office, who's the Director of Traffic Safety Advocacy and Research. And he's an epidemiologist by training, so he loves to look at things from the public health lens. So good morning to both of you. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and good to see you, Russ.
Yeah, you too. Good morning, everyone.
And, all right, excellent. So I'll get into the questions, but I do just want to let the audience know, and if at any point you have any questions for our speakers, feel free to type them in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. But I guess we'll start off with a general question, and I'd like to hear maybe from both of you on this, but I'll start with Russ. We're hearing so much about the infrastructure aspects. Biden came out with an infrastructure bill, the American Jobs Plan. We're hearing things about transportation reauthorization, about the amount of funding for highways and bridges and transit and Amtrak, and those are all obviously very important, and especially for safety, we know that keeping our bridges and our transit system in a state of good repair is very important. But how much are you hearing from legislators about the other aspects of safety, whether it's kind of the behavioral aspects or some of the regulatory aspects at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration?
Well, so that's a good question. There's a lot of different conversations going on in Congress. I think things tend to be cast through the infrastructure, through the lens of infrastructure, because we talk about transportation, and historically, all those committees are focused on passing legislation that has to do with building roads, and safety has become a part of that, or maybe it always was a part of that, but it's become such a big part of that. And then the safety of drivers and vehicles have kind of been tacked onto that. At NHTSA, I can tell you that they're squarely focused on the safety of drivers, the safety of vehicles. I will say that I know I can tell you from GHSA's perspective, we think all the elements of the system are important. They all contribute to the safety equation in some way and address different aspects of the safety problem. And there are some safety issues that just are not responsive to infrastructure, some issues that are not responsive to enforcement or education. And so we need all this stuff working all together in order to eventually have any hope of eventually reaching zero fatalities.
How about you, Jake?
I would echo what Russ said. I would just add that I think, if you set hard safety or infrastructure safety aside for just a moment, it kind of runs the gamut what different members of Congress are talking about. They all have, their pet issues and sort of lead on different behavioral highway safety issues. I mean, a couple of examples. We have members who are pushing hard on, research to understand the effectiveness of move over laws and to see what we can do to better protect, first responders and tow truck operators at the roadside rescuing people. we've got members who are squarely focused on things that are, I know, very important to GHSA and in Russia's world about the administrative burden put on state highway safety offices and addressing issues of eligibility for states to access behavioral highway safety grant funds, in areas where they're currently not eligible to access those resources to do really important work. So, and then you have other members who are really high on issues like impaired driving prevention. And a good example of that would be making the car the cure, the DADS program, and specifically sort of opening it up to innovation, to other technologies inspired by but different from DADS, to see who can get this kind of technology to market for consumers the fastest. So in short, it just kind of depends on who you ask, but the good news is there's variety, and there are a lot of issues on the behavioral side that are important to different members of Congress.
Thanks, Russ and Jake. And I guess I'll ping pong back. I'll go with Jake first for this question, but again, for both of you, just for the reauthorization bill, what are your priorities, or I guess for AAA, what are our priorities?
So we can get into the nitty gritty here, but just staying 30,000 feet, broad strokes, I'd say, we're interested in providing states with more flexibility to put limited resources that we have in highway safety on the behavioral side in particular to address the issues that are most important locally, rather than having super prescriptive areas where you can spend dollars and requirements around having to spend X dollars here before you can spend Y dollars over there. The trade-off there, the sort of the other side of the sword, is that with more flexibility, you risk the loss of focus. And there are belts, boots, and speed, distracted driving, and so depending on the areas, the traffic safety areas that are most important to you, you may be more amenable to providing states more flexibility or less, if you want to make sure that there is focus maintained on those issues. So we're trying to walk that line and allow data to drive decision making without risking the loss of focus on some of the most important areas in highway safety. Other things are modernizing the new car assessment program. So I think the last time that NCAP was updated was in 2011. And obviously there are a lot of new technologies out today that didn't exist at that time. And while I think at AAA we recognize that lawmakers and public policy will never keep up with innovation and technology, we could do a better job than we are. And so there are, I think, some near-term ways that we can incorporate some advanced driver assistance technologies into NCAP that don't exist today, both in terms of just recognizing and shedding some light on them, but also including those technologies in the way that we rate vehicles, new cars, to help consumers make better decisions.
Thanks, Jake, and same question for you, Russ.
We're probably along the same lines as AAA in terms of the grant programs for states. And I'd say 90% of what we focus on is trying to improve things within the grant programs that our members are the primary recipients of. And so we're really focused on structural issues that help our members and the highway safety community in general address all issues. So it's not just impaired driving or distracted driving. It's all these things are important, but how can we set up safety programs in general to make it easier for states and communities to make a difference. So we prioritize local control. We prioritize increasing eligibility for states so that we can get more resources out there on the state and local level to implement programs. And we prioritize allowable use, which is a term of art, but it's really like once you get a grant, what can you use it for? Because of the way that Congress has set up separate grant programs and they have their guardrails, we've seen it be more difficult for states to do things that they want to do in safety because this grant is only for these purposes, so you can't spend any of that money for this, and it just makes it more complicated, a complicated task to put these programs together and execute these activities. So we're trying to liberalize all of that and make sure that the investment in safety across the board remains high in general. And I would be remiss not to mention equity, which I think we may probably will talk about later, but all the discussion that's happening about transportation equity is incredibly important to GHSA and I'm sure to AAA as well. And we want to make sure that when Congress takes a look at all the transportation programs that we're addressing equity in the way that will make the most difference, both for equity and for safety.
Thanks, Russ. That's great to hear. And I guess we'll delve in a little bit to the grant programs coming down a little bit from 30,000 feet, although maybe not all the way down in the muck. But I guess what aspects of the grant programs as currently constituted do you think are working well or not well? Or I don't know if this is like a, choosing a favorite or least favorite child, but is there a grant program that you could point to and say like this is really a model, or we do not want to see anything like this again?
Well, I would say from our perspective, what has worked the best are the grant programs that provide resources to states and communities with the least strings attached. Often grant programs are set up and they have all kinds of federal oversight and restrictions and all that. It makes for a lot of paperwork, but it also doesn't typically make it easier to do safety programs. So when you look at what is known as the State and Community Grant Program, or the Section 402, it's formula funded. It's not competitive. States get the money. They can, as long as they're doing their own data-driven problem identification and performance management, they can use those funds to dedicate to the programs, as long as it's going towards the things that the biggest problems and the ways that will make the biggest difference. States have a lot of flexibility to use them. But on the other hand, from GHSA's perspective, some of the programs that haven't been working well are these national priority or incentive grant programs that Congress has been cultivating over the last 20 years or so. So these are separate grant programs for issues like distracted driving or impaired driving or non-motorized safety. And not that these issues are not important, but by separating them out into different grant programs that you attach eligibility standards for, it makes it more difficult for states to get the money in the first place. And then there are guardrails for when the states receive the money, that they have their guardrails on the ways that they can use it. A really good example is the National Incentive Grant Program for GDL, for graduated driver licensing laws, which I think was set up in 2012 or thereabouts. No state has ever been awarded that grant. So why do we even have it? If it's just not making a difference. I mean, what it aimed to do is to incent states to pass better GDL laws, but no states are reaching that bar. Now, I'm not saying that these grants have not been effective in some cases in getting states to take action or to look at those eligibility standards and think, well, how can we update our laws, our state GDL laws, or our state traffic safety laws? But I think the amount of money is so small that for most states, it's kind of a conceit to think that this is going to get state legislatures to take dramatic action on highway safety. If there was a ton more money attached to it, maybe, but the lived experience has been that a lot of these incentives have not really been all that effective. And so from our perspective, our members would I mean, we wouldn't worry if it was all turned into a formula funded program, so that we can have a little more flexibility out there on the state level.
Yeah, we have to remember that the complicated existence of the federal incentive grant program that Russ just described, it came from a good place, well-meaning legislators. And so we have to remind ourselves of that. So it's to draw focus and to force the states, hopefully, to lead them down the road of addressing really important highway safety issues. But the reality is what's important, or from an epidemiological standpoint, a priority safety issue that needs to be addressed in one state may not be the case in another state. And so it's unfortunate in the state where it's not a priority that those funds are not accessible to that state to use on something that is a big issue. And to Russ's point, when the pot of money is so small for one issue, and let's say it happens to be a big issue where, in your state, you could do more if you had access to more funds, but they're tied up in a grant that you're not eligible for, or that is to address an issue that's not a top priority from an epidemiological point of view. So, that's the sort of the double-edged sword that I was alluding to before. So one way around that is performance metrics, where you're sort of forcing states to look at the data on a variety of highway safety issues and the contributing factors to those kinds of crashes, and to use that information to help say, all right, well, here's where most people are being injured or killed in crashes in our state. These are the areas where we need to spend, the most money and focus most of our attention. And if the state at that point could, access more resources than in the future than they can today to do a really robust job of addressing those issues, with the hope to see those numbers fall and those performance metrics over time, would be ideal. But to the paperwork issue that Russ alluded to, we want the talented people at the state level to spend more of their time implementing effective programs and less time completing and submitting paperwork. So it's a complicated issue to solve, but we've been at it for many years and we're going to keep at it. You know, the one additional thing I would say in terms of what's not working, and to be fair to NHTSA specifically, it's not always the case, but I think that there should be more stringent requirements around the use of funds through these incentive grant programs through the highway bill to dedicate them or to spend them on proven effective countermeasures. And so in many cases, that is exactly what happens. And NHTSA provides a lot of really good guidance to states to help them do that. They even have a document that is labeled countermeasures that work, and they update it every couple of years through partnership with GHSA. But NHTSA is a political organization at the end of the day, and no matter the talent of the staff at NHTSA, you know, politics is a factor. And I think the one example of an area where NHTSA could do better than they are now at providing good guidance to states to target limited resources in highway safety to proven effective things is in the area of consumer education. And so, you know, on the one hand, there are high visibility enforcement programs, which in some cases have been proven to be wildly effective, like on Click It or Ticket. But states also have a latitude to spend some of these dollars on other consumer education programs, which again, these interests come from a really good place. I think about like driving high as more states legalize cannabis. A lot of states have funded using federal dollars consumer education programs on, you know, trying to get people to drive sober and not high. And so that goal is admirable, but consumer education that is effective and that actually motivates real behavior change is really hard to achieve. It's really expensive to do right, and you need to evaluate it. And that rarely happens. And this isn't unique to traffic safety. It rarely happens in all areas of public health. And so I feel like there is an opportunity to do better there.
Jake, yeah.
No, go ahead, Russ.
Jake's absolutely right. You know, it's easy to see, you know, something you built in the real world. It's easy to see cops doing enforcement, but like the impact of public education is really difficult for people to. It's intangible. It's difficult to reach out and touch. And so there has not been enough evaluation. And I think we've all seen, you know, campaigns that are like, oh, that seems like junk. But it's an important part. And if we can crack the code on some of this traffic safety education or outreach, I think we'll be able to make a greater difference in that.
Yeah, one of the most common cringeworthy moments for me is when I hear, usually it's state lawmakers say, oh, we just need to educate people, it'll be fine.
Yeah.
I'm like, all right, well, that's not going to work. Education is necessary, but it's insufficient by itself to make a difference. So you have to have it, but you can't just do that and expect big changes.
Sure.
And I mean, it sounds like there's an interesting tension, and I don't necessarily want to get too much into the politics necessarily. Obviously, you know, we know this infrastructure bill and reauthorization is political, but it would seem like some of the lawmakers who might be thoughtful about wanting to reduce the administrative burden on states or anyone applying for grants, they might also be the same lawmakers that are very vigilant about saying, let's make sure that every, you know, dollar that is spent from the federal treasury is spent well. So do you kind of get that tension between, you know, like you want to reduce the administrative burden, but I guess how much of the after the fact measurement, like you said, the performance metrics and after the fact evaluation, how much of that do lawmakers really want?
Well, I would say that I don't know how much those things are real concerns either. So reducing administrative burden is really important for program implementation, but doesn't make for a good press release or a good social media post. So I don't think there's a lot of investment into doing those things. I think legislators are probably more drawn to big, bold actions, such as Jake mentioned this effort on impaired driving technology. It's this big transformative thing, and so there are bills in Congress and people talking about that. Or to the classic example of building an infrastructure piece somewhere in your district. Also, this notion of not wanting to spend too much money, I think Congress has proven it's pretty willing to spend taxpayer money in the deficit, with seemingly no consideration for tomorrow. So I think the tension is more like along the lines of the things that members of Congress are personally interested, with things that sort of work politically for them, or things that they can point to as their accomplishments, versus other things that we also are interested in to try and make programs run more effectively. So that would include administrative burdens, making sure our performance management system is meaningful and works well. And Jake alluded to some of the less exciting aspects of researching the stuff and evaluating things to make sure that they actually do work.
Yeah, and I would just add, and Russ, you and I have talked about this offline before in the past, is that our peers in the safety community are we're kind of causing this problem, right? So you think about, safety organizations that are single issue organizations. Mm-hmm. What does their leadership want? What do their members want? The people they serve, what do they want? They want that organization to say, lobby for something and to be able to say, look what we did, look what we accomplished, look what we made happen. And I can't blame them for that. But one of the implications or outcomes of that is an incentive grant program for one specific issue that comes with lots of strings attached to it. So,
and yeah, something that, like, an issue that kills like 10 people a year, which that's all horrible and tragic, but like that doesn't compare to impaired driving, where you have 10,000 people killed every year and 100 people on the weekend at any given weekend. So it's kind of that's a tension that definitely exists, with people wanting different things.
And I think one of the single issues, we actually got a question from an audience member who's an elected official in New York State, and marijuana legalization obviously is a concern. And I think, he's looking for potentially some things that he might be able to do locally, but I also do wonder, is there more focus on, I know you're not necessarily enamored with the single issue grant programs, but with legalization becoming more popular, are there more things that are looking specifically at marijuana, even within the drug impaired driving umbrella?
I mean, I'm not aware of anything that is specific to cannabis, but to driving more generally, cannabis included, yeah, there is some work being done there. And so, like, an example would be, so we have breathalyzers, portable breath testing devices to detect alcohol impaired drivers on the road. And so there's this big push to have, quote unquote, a breathalyzer for drugs other than alcohol, or we can just use cannabis as one example. But there are not currently model specifications and a conforming devices list that NHTSA provides as guidance to states to utilize other technologies for that purpose. And so probably the most promising example would be utilizing oral fluid or saliva to detect drug drivers at the roadside. So there's technology that'll allow you within 10 minutes to have a result, positive or negative, for a short list of drugs other than alcohol. And so it would be helpful if there were some consistency or some guidance from NHTSA around, these are the devices that work best. You can utilize federal grants to buy the devices on this list. That doesn't exist for that technology today. And in fact, NHTSA is not authorized to do that. And so that's an opportunity for Congress to provide that authorization to NHTSA to do that work. They also have to provide NHTSA with the staff and the funding to do the research to get there. And so just want to use that as an example to address your question, but also to clarify that it's not a lack of will necessarily at NHTSA. It's, they're not allowed legally to do that work, and only Congress can give them that authority. So that would be an opportunity for that lawmaker who posed that question.
Yeah, I was talking to someone about that earlier or another day, and I think it was that 1994 was the first time NHTSA released its conforming products list for breathalyzers. But breathalyzers have been in widespread use, I think, since the early 80s. So we might be in for a long haul before they get around to publishing that list, although I hope things can be accelerated now that we know what we're doing. But to go back to your original question, I don't think you'll ever see anything structurally in terms of grants. You never see like a grant. This grant is specifically for marijuana impaired driving. I don't think that would make sense because you don't know what's going to happen until you pull over a driver and see what's going on there. So, and all the tools that we have for impaired driving detection and adjudication are valuable for all different kinds of substances. So I think we want to try and address programs, impaired driving programs holistically. Impaired driving is impaired driving, but within those programs have tools and resources and training that so that you can address all different kinds of substances. But Jake mentioned technology, new kinds of technology. There's a wide range of other kinds of initiatives like electronic warrants and or oral fluid testing and all these things that they aim to expedite drug impaired driving investigations. One interesting thing that is happening in states that are legalizing marijuana are partnerships between the safety community and the marijuana community, even down to the dispensary level, sort of analogous to the way that we might partner with businesses that serve alcohol about safe consumption and safe driving and things like that. So there's probably a lot of room for growth there, and also a way to take advantage of, I think, more trusted messengers. Because if you think about someone who is a regular marijuana user and you want to try to break through to them about the risks and responsible behavior, are they more likely to listen to a police officer or information they receive from the dispensary? I think it's probably the latter.
Yeah, especially for a product where there's no label that is consistent from one state. You know more about what's in a can of Diet Coke by looking at the side of the packaging than you do about what you purchased at a dispensary. So I think it's up to organizations like GHSA and AAA and others in the safety community to make sure that dispensaries are armed with reliable and factual information that can help consumers make good choices.
Makes sense. And I know we're running somewhat short on time, so there are a couple questions left, but I'll get to the first and I think most important one, and we'll see if we have time for the other. And it's about equity, and I know you alluded to it earlier, Russ. And so many of the grant programs that are out there, not all, but a lot, are about grants for enforcement and high visibility enforcement, which, as Jake said, we know that's been proven to be, effective for some of the grant programs. But also there's obviously a lot of legitimate concern about over-reliance on police enforcement when it comes to traffic safety. How are you or your organizations and how are legislators thinking about transportation equity when it comes to these sort of enforcement grant programs? I guess, Russ, you want to take it first, and then we can go to Jake.
Sure. Well, so equity has become a major priority for GHSA over the last year. We released a statement about equity and racism policing last September. We've filed, we've addressed it in comments to NHTSA and in letters for the record with Congress, with congressional hearings. And I think our take on it is that, as you're right, I mean, there is a lot of investment in law enforcement, and all of us in the safety community have strong partnerships with law enforcement agencies for traffic enforcement. But at the same time, there's no disputing everything that's happened, and not only in these outrageous incidences of police misconduct, but also just a general lived experience of people in communities who see the disparities act out in their lives every day, and we can't ignore that. And so what we want to do is try and find a way that we can improve the way that we're implementing programs that rely on enforcement to integrate equity into it and advance equity and achieve equitable outcomes, because we know the traffic enforcement is effective. We can't afford to throw out traffic enforcement because there's no way we'll be able to accomplish our mission without at least some element of traffic enforcement. So how can we make traffic enforcement more equitable? Briefly, in Congress, there was some concern about progressive voices out there that are calling for an end to traffic enforcement or an end to policing in general, and a sense that, I mean, in my opinion, that they're almost like hijacking the conversation about traffic safety to use it towards those other purposes. But within the legislation that we've seen that is advancing through Congress, at least for reauthorization, I think the reforms are a lot more modest. It's more about reforming the program to provide more resources to states for racial profiling data collection and analysis. There are model programs out there for that. The House reauthorization proposal would create a new national center of excellence on traffic enforcement that we were supportive of. We hope it will create more resources and best practices that our members can use to integrate into the programs that they're implementing out there on the state and local level. I could talk about this all day. So, but I guess the bottom line is it's very much a priority for GHSA, and we're working with Congress and NHTSA and our members to integrate it into everything that we do.
That's great, Jake. I'll give you the last word.
Appreciate it. Yeah, so we've spent a lot of time listening. We've been working closely and having multiple meetings with some of the advocates on the other side looking to abolish police entirely, and trying to understand their point of view and to understand what, the people that they're serving, that they're advocating for, why are they asking for what they're asking, what are intermediate steps between here and their ultimate goal, and recognizing in that long list of things that they're gunning for, what can AAA support? How can we help solve for this issue? Because it's important and it's real and we have to address it. And so Russ mentioned data, and as a data nerd, I would support that. I think, there are some states right now where it is illegal to collect data on racial profiling, which is kind of a racist point of view to say we don't want to know if there's a problem. So that's step one. We have to make sure that states are collecting the data that would help them to understand if there's a problem and where it's located, so that we can pinpoint interventions to address it. And Russ alluded to some of the model programs that are out there, like in Connecticut. And some states are starting to move in that direction already, even before the highway bill, which is encouraging. I would say that, automated enforcement is an opportunity to rely less on traditional law enforcement and more on technology to enforce certain highway safety laws. So that's a good thing. But we have to also be careful that we're not implementing automated enforcement programs only in communities of color, where they're the ones who will be penalized primarily economically through the penalties and fines. And so we have to figure that out. And we have more work to do on that front. And then lastly, I would talk about messaging. And so I think about, I'll go back to Click It or Ticket as a highly effective, high visibility enforcement program that is heavily reliant on traditional law enforcement. So that's a highly successful program, but we could do a better job of being more careful and understanding the communities in which we're operating beefed up enforcement, saturated patrols for enforcing seatbelt laws, and that we're not only doing it in communities of color. I also think that there is one message that has been developed through the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration for all motorists, regardless of your age or your skin color. And there is this highly resistant last 10% of people that travel every day improperly or completely unrestrained. And the messages that we've done for the last 30 years are not going to suddenly tomorrow work for that last 10%. And if you look at the demographics of that group, it's people of color primarily. And so we could do a better job of developing new messaging for those communities, for those demographics, to help address the issue in a way that resonates with them and that is meaningful to them, so that we deter the behavior of driving without your seatbelt on and eliminate the need to be pulled over by police altogether.
Well, lots of great stuff from both, both AAA and GHSA, and both you, Jake, and Russ. And I know we ran a couple minutes over, but I think it was worth it for that part of the conversation. So really appreciate you both joining us this morning. For the folks in the audience, the next webinar in our series will be, I guess, almost 2 weeks from today exactly. And we're going to hear from Beth Osborne of Transportation for America. So that should be a great conversation about transit and active modes of transportation. So looking forward to that. And again, you'll be able to find this this webinar on our AAA Northeast YouTube page. So I'll send that out to all the folks who attended. Feel free to share it with your colleagues. And lastly, once again, just want to thank Russ and Jake for their time, and wish everyone have a pleasant Tuesday afternoon.
I echo that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.